Well, let me start by saying I wouldn't call it a multipolar order because that would mean that there's some sort of agreement on the rules. The United States is backing away from globalization and just letting the pieces fall. And it's up to countries to scramble for whatever they can. But in the case of Russia specifically, when the Soviet Union existed, the Soviet Empire was one of the largest empires we've ever had on Earth, and they were able to occupy certain territories that have always been critical to the Russians' view of themselves. If you look at a map of population or of farmland in Russia, they're going to perfectly overlap. You're talking about an area that starts at the Ukrainian border and stretches east into Siberia, and it's surrounded by a lot of open, flat territory. And so the Russians have tended to get invaded over 50 times in their history through those open, flat territories. So the Russian goal going back to Catherine the Great has always been the same. Expand beyond those flats until you can control the gateways that give access to the Russian space. Places like the Timir Gap in Central Asia, or the Altai Gap going to China, or the Baltic Sea coast. And when the Soviet Union existed, they controlled all 9 of the gateways. When it was reduced to rump Russia, they went from 9 to 1. And everything that Putin has done since has been about getting Russian boots into those gaps to secure it for the future. So we had the uprising in Kazakhstan. Russian troops went. That plugged the gap. We had the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict last summer. Russian troops went in as part of the peacekeeping group. They plugged a gap. The Russians invaded Crimea in 2014. They went in, they took it, they plugged a gap. And 2 of the remaining gaps are on the other side of Ukraine, specifically the Polish and Bessarabian gaps that in the past the Germans or the Turks have used to invade. So from the Russian point of view, this was always going to happen. The only question was timing. And when it became apparent that the tide had turned in the United States, Putin felt he needed to act very quickly. If you remember back to the impeachment hearings for Donald Trump, the very, very short version is that Trump admitted publicly to blackmailing the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, in order to get some dirt on the Biden family. And when that didn't work, he suspended military transfers to Ukraine. Now, under Biden, those military transfers had started up again, and in November of last year is when the Javelin anti-tank missiles started making it to the front. And the Russians realized that the balance of forces were shifting against them, and so they realized they needed to go now. And that's where we are. If in 2014 the Russians had moved and just taken Ukraine in whole, I think they would have had an easier time of it than they have. They took Crimea without firing a shot. But they also went into the Donbass and the Luhansk and Donetsk provinces, backed what they say are separatist groups, even though they're Russian staffed and have Russian intelligence and Russian weapons and Russian special forces and Russian logistics. Whatever. Propaganda. By keeping that conflict hot for 8 years, they did the single best thing they could have done to consolidate the Ukrainian national identity. Most people in Ukraine before that didn't even think of themselves as Ukrainian, especially in the eastern half of the country. Now they do. And we've seen, I don't want to overplay this because we're only in the 3rd week of the war, but the degree of just absolute incompetence in planning and strategy and logistics that we have seen on the Russian side is mind-boggling. It is worse than what the Iraqis were doing during the first Desert Storm conflict. So if they had done this back in 2014, 2015, they probably would have been in Kiev in a couple of weeks, and they probably would have conquered the entire country in less than 3 months. Now we're probably looking at double the amount of time, and then they'll be facing a raging firestorm of a guerrilla war in order to occupy a country of 45 million people. This is shaping how the United States views the conflict. Because when this first happened, we just assumed that they would steamroller the Ukrainian forces. They're outnumbered, they're outgunned, their logistical capacity is awful. They have very few pieces of heavy equipment that you could stand up to a major Russian assault. But that convoy really changed minds in Washington, both in DOD and the White House. Because we saw this 40-mile convoy that should have been able to just devastate Kiev. And it stalled out in a day because it ran out of fuel. And then its troops abandoned it 2 days later because they ran out of food. That's Keystone Cops invasion stuff. And so we now know that if an American force comes up against a Russian force, the Russian force is going to be obliterated. And while that might make us feel good in terms of a conventional war, for the Russians, this is an issue of absolute national security for them. And if American forces of any type become involved in that kind of conflict, the Russians will have two choices: a humiliating strategic withdrawal that they may never recover from, or escalate to nukes. So the plan in NATO, the plan in Washington now, is to feed as many weapon systems as we can into the Ukrainian space. Anything that does not require a fixed point support. So no planes, no fixed air defense assets, but lots of missiles, lots of vehicles. And keep the Russians locked down on Ukraine as long as possible. Because if they can't finish Ukraine to their satisfaction, there's no point in them then rolling further west to get to their real goals. So this has become the Russian killing field. That's the plan now, to make sure that this is the last war that Russia can ever fight anywhere. Well, let's deal with Obama first. Obama was famous for not allowing anyone into the White House that disagreed with him. And if they did agree with him, they had 90 seconds to make their point, and then he wanted them out. He hated conversing with people. So as a commander-in-chief, he and Donald Trump in many ways were two sides of the same coin. Obama didn't want to talk to anyone about anything, and Trump would talk to anyone, just not about whatever the topic of the moment was supposed to be. It's not that I think that Biden's a great president. It's not even that I think he's the best president we've had in 13 years. I think he's the only president we've had in 13 years. And so, no, Obama would have not led a coalition in the way that Biden did, because he would have never even discussed the intelligence with his staff. And then, of course, Trump was so self-absorbed that the idea of getting involved in another country's military conflict, no matter what the pros or the cons would happen to be, would have just gone out the window. So yes, under the previous two presidents, the Russians could have just rolled. Considering what Biden said during his campaign and what his foreign policy was for the first year, I think Putin very clearly thought that this was just the third in a row. And I think that's the biggest surprise that Putin has had, is that the United States actually has stood up for the first time in over a decade. So whether that's a miscalculation or not, we can have that debate. But this has a bit of a Cuban Missile Crisis feel to it, in that the Russians were sure that the Americans would back down or just not show up. And so far, that's been a miscalculation. For the military strategy piece, I'm going to have to go with a hard no. I mean, I was thinking the same thing in the first couple of the first couple of weeks.
Sure feels like it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know. What's that saying? For decades, nothing happens. Then in some weeks, decades
Vladimir
happen.
Lenin.
Yeah. Oh my God, smart dude. So that is definitely what I thought in the first couple of weeks. That there's a piece missing here. The Russians will plug it in. They're still going to walk over this. But as days go on, it hasn't happened. And only giving your troops 2 days of food to occupy a city of 3 million? No, that's not enough. For a convoy 40 miles long to not have fuel trucks? I'm sorry, that's horrible planning. There was an attack this morning, it's March 17, on the airfield at Kherson, which is the one city that the Russians have captured. It came down the road from Mariupol, which is a road that supposedly the Russians control. And it involved air assets, and there's no excuse for why the Russians have not secured air superiority just yet. They've got their anti-aircraft missile batteries ringing Ukraine, giving them like 95% coverage. Drones are still operating. They should all be shot down. The Ukrainians are still running 25 to 30 sorties a day. They shouldn't have an air force at all.